Chapter 1. The Harbor at Sevastopol. At 0230 hours local time, a Ukrainian naval drone operator sat in a bunker hundreds of miles from the Black Sea, watching a live feed from a camera bobbing gently on the surface of the water. The picture was grainy, lit only by the dim glow of harbor lights reflecting off the waves. Ahead, the silhouette of Sevastopol's naval base slowly came into focus, its cranes and warehouses rising like dark shapes against the night sky. Somewhere inside that harbor sat a Russian warship, one that had spent the past several days moving in and out of dock, always returning to the same berth along the eastern pier. This was not the first time Ukraine had tried to strike a target inside Sevastopol. Russian air defenses around the base were dense, layered, and had improved significantly since the war began. Panzer systems ringed the coastline. Radar stations scanned the water day and night. Patrol boats crisscrossed the harbor entrance, watching for exactly the kind of intrusion that was now creeping toward them at just a few knots, barely making a wake. But this operation depended on something other than firepower. It depended on patience. For nearly 3 weeks, Ukrainian intelligence had been tracking the movement patterns of this particular vessel, a missile corvette that had become one of the more active ships in Russia's Black Sea fleet. Its captain seemed to favor a predictable routine. Patrol runs along the coast, then a return to the same mooring point to resupply and rotate crew. That predictability was about to become a fatal weakness. The drone crept closer, its small radar cross-section and low profile keeping it beneath the detection threshold of most coastal radar systems. The operator adjusted the throttle slightly, easing off to avoid creating a wake that might catch the eye of a harbor patrol. Behind him, an intelligence officer studied a laptop showing satellite imagery updated only hours earlier. The warship was there, still docked. Crew activity minimal. Conditions were, for the moment, close to perfect. What none of them could know yet was whether the ship would still be there by the time the drone arrived. Warships in wartime rarely sit still for long. A change of orders, a fueling delay, even something as mundane as weather could send the vessel back out to sea before the strike could be completed. Every minute the drone spent closing the distance was a minute in which the entire operation could unravel. The operator kept his eyes locked on the screen, watching the shape of the pier grow larger, watching for any sign of movement that would tell him the target had already left. So far, nothing. The warship sat exactly where the last satellite pass had shown it, lying still fastened to the dock, exactly where Ukraine needed it to be. Behind the operator, a small team of analysts monitored a bank of secondary screens, cross-referencing the live feed against archived imagery collected over the previous weeks. Every angle of the pier, every crane position, every neighboring vessel had been cataloged and studied so that any deviation from the expected picture would be spotted instantly. This kind of preparation was not glamorous work. It involved long hours squinting at satellite photographs, comparing shadows cast by cranes at different times of day, and noting the smallest shifts in how ships were moored along the pier. Chapter 2. Weeks of watching. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to go back nearly a month to when Ukrainian intelligence first identified this vessel as a priority target. It wasn't the biggest ship in the fleet, and it wasn't the most heavily armed. What made it valuable was what it represented. A workhorse of Russia's coastal operations used for patrol duty, for escorting supply convoys, and occasionally for launching cruise missiles into Ukrainian territory. Removing it from service would not just be a symbolic win, it would create a real gap in Russia's ability to protect its own coastline. Ukrainian military intelligence, working alongside naval special operations units, began building a pattern of life on the ship. Analysts pored over satellite images, comparing dock positions day after day. Signals intelligence teams monitored radio traffic from the base, listening for scheduling chatter, crew rotations, refueling requests. Slowly, a picture emerged. The ship followed a loose but identifiable rhythm, several days at sea on patrol, followed by 2 or 3 days docked for resupply and maintenance, then back out again. This rhythm gave Ukraine something rare in modern naval warfare: a predictable window. Most of Russia's larger warships had learned to avoid extended stays in port after repeated strikes on Sevastopol throughout the war. Commanders had grown cautious, often keeping vessels moving or spreading them across multiple bases to reduce the risk of a single successful attack, destroying several ships at once. But this particular corvette's captain, whether out of habit or the sheer demands of maintenance and crew welfare, kept returning to the same berth. Ukrainian planners debated whether to strike the ship at sea or wait for it to dock. Open water offered no direct escape from air defenses, but the vessel also had freedom to maneuver, could break off suddenly, and had its own point defense systems active whenever underway. Docked, the ship was far less able to evade, but the harbor itself was heavily defended with radar, patrol craft, and air defense batteries positioned specifically to protect it. The decision came down to timing. If the drones could approach in a way that avoided detection long enough to close the final distance, dock strikes offered a higher probability of a clean hit against a stationary, undefended broadside. That meant building an approach corridor that stayed below radar coverage, avoided known patrol routes, and arrived during a window when crew attention aboard the ship and along the pier would be at its lowest. Nighttime departures from patrol, followed by early morning arrivals back at port, created exactly that kind of window. Crews coming off a multi-day patrol were tired, focused on mooring procedures, refueling, and handoffs, not on scanning the harbor for a small, low-profile object skimming across the water. It was during one of these early morning returns that Ukrainian intelligence finally confirmed a docking pattern reliable enough to plan the strike around. There was also a human element to this planning that rarely made it into after-action reports. Ukrainian handlers had cultivated a small network of contacts near the port, ordinary people whose daily routines happened to bring them within sight of the naval base. A dock worker mentioning an offhand comment about a ship's expected return, a fisherman noting unusual patrol boat activity. None of this information alone would have been enough to plan an attack. But combined with satellite imagery and signals intelligence, it added texture and confidence to a picture that otherwise remained frustratingly incomplete. Chapter 3. Building the weapon. The drones Ukraine intended to use for this operation were not off-the-shelf products. They were the result of nearly 2 years of trial, failure, and rapid iteration by naval engineers working largely outside traditional military procurement channels. Early versions had been crude, built from repurposed jet ski hulls, packed with explosives, and guided by simple remote control links vulnerable to jamming. Many had failed. Some had been intercepted before reaching their targets, others had simply broken down in rough seas. But each failure fed into the next design. Engineers reduced the radar cross-section by lowering the hull profile until barely a few inches sat above the waterline. They improved the guidance systems, adding inertial navigation to supplement satellite positioning, so that even if GPS signals were jammed or spoofed, the drone could continue toward its target using onboard sensors alone. Range increased, payload capacity increased, and critically, reliability increased, because a naval drone that broke down halfway across the Black Sea was worse than useless. By the time this operation was being planned, the current generation of drones could travel hundreds of kilometers on a single mission, maintain a stable course in moderate sea states, and carry a warhead large enough to cause serious structural damage to a warship's hull. Multiple drones would be used in this strike, not because a single hit wouldn't be effective, but because naval commanders had learned through hard experience that redundancy mattered. Air defenses could get lucky. Patrol boats could spot one drone and miss another. Sending in more than one increased the odds that at least one, ideally more, would reach the target. The operators guiding these drones worked from secure locations far from the coast, watching video feeds transmitted back through a combination of satellite and radio links. Piloting a naval drone toward a heavily defended harbor required a very particular kind of patience. Unlike an aerial drone that could climb, dive, and maneuver in 3 dimensions, a surface drone was locked to the water's plane, meaning every evasive maneuver had to work within a much narrower set of options. As the mission date approached, planners finalized their approach vectors. The drones would depart from a staging point along the Ukrainian-controlled coastline, travel a wide arc out into open water to avoid the most heavily patrolled approaches, then turn back towards Sevastopol from an angle Russian defenses had historically covered less densely. It wasn't a perfect blind spot. No such thing existed anymore. But it was the best available path, chosen based on months of accumulated data about where Russian radar and patrol coverage was thinnest. Engineers had also spent considerable effort on the warheads themselves, working to balance explosive yield against the added weight and drag that came with a larger payload. Too small a charge risked failing to breach the hull deeply enough to cause meaningful flooding. Too large a charge slowed the drone down and reduced its range. The final design represented a compromise refined over dozens of test detonations against decommissioned hull sections. Chapter 4. The approach begins. On the night of the operation, the drones slipped out from their staging point under cover of darkness, running at low speed to minimize their wake and acoustic signature. The Black Sea was calm that night with only a light chop on the surface, ideal conditions for a low-profile approach. Too much wave action could toss a small drone around, potentially disrupting its camera feed or navigation stability. Too little, and any wake it did create would stand out more starkly against still water. The conditions that night sat in a comfortable middle ground. For the first several hours, the drones traveled largely unnoticed, running dark without transmitting anything that could give away their position to passive listening posts along the coast. Operators back at the control center watched telemetry data, confirming each drone remained on course, monitoring fuel consumption, checking in periodically via brief, low-power data bursts designed to minimize the chance of detection. As the formation approached the outer edges of Russian radar coverage, the real tension began. Russian coastal radar stations, upgraded repeatedly throughout the war in response to earlier drone strikes, scanned the surface of the sea continuously. Some of these radars were designed specifically to catch exactly this kind of small, low-flying or low-floating target, a direct response to Ukraine's earlier successes against ships anchored near Sevastopol. If even one drone in the formation was detected too early, Russian forces could scramble patrol boats, alert coastal gun batteries, or simply move the target ship before the drones arrived. To reduce this risk, the drones traveled along a path that hugged the boundary of radar coverage rather than cutting straight toward the target. This added time to the journey, but it kept the formation and the statistical gaps between radar sweep patterns for as long as possible. Every additional minute spent undetected was a minute closer to a successful strike. Roughly two-thirds of the way through the approach, one of the drones experienced a minor course deviation, likely caused by a stronger than expected current, pulling it slightly off its planned track. The operator noticed the drift within moments, thanks to constant monitoring of the onboard navigation display, and made a small correction. It was a reminder that even with sophisticated guidance systems, human oversight remained essential. As the formation neared the final approach corridor, operators began reducing speed further, trading time for stealth. The harbor entrance to Sevastopol loomed ahead in the drone's low-resolution camera feeds, buoys marking the channel, distant lights from the base illuminating the water in patches. Somewhere beyond those lights sat the Warship, still moored, according to the last confirmed intelligence update. Everything now depended on whether that information remained accurate and whether the defenses ringing the harbor would notice these small, dark shapes creeping toward them across the water. Chapter 5. Russian defenses react too late. At approximately 0140 hours, a Russian patrol boat crossing the harbor entrance picked up an anomalous return on its short-range radar. The signal was faint, flickering in and out, easily mistaken for sea clutter or a stray piece of floating debris. The crew aboard noted it, discussed it briefly, and continued their patrol route without immediately investigating further. This was not unusual. Coastal patrols dealt with dozens of false alarms every night, and chasing down every flicker on a radar screen would have made effective patrolling impossible. But this particular flicker did not disappear. It reappeared on the next sweep, slightly closer, moving at a speed inconsistent with debris drifting on the current. The patrol boat's commander ordered a course change to investigate, swinging the vessel toward the suspicious contact. By the time the patrol boat's spotlight swept across the water where the radar return had been detected, the drone had already altered course, slipping into a stretch of water partially obscured by the shadow of a nearby breakwater. Meanwhile, further along the coast, a second contact had been detected by a land-based radar station responsible for monitoring the approaches to Sevastopol. This station, having been burned before by drone strikes earlier in the war, was quicker to escalate. An alert was passed up the chain of command, and orders went out to nearby patrol vessels to increase their speed and converge on the suspected intrusion point. For a brief window, it looked as though Russian forces might catch the formation before it reached the inner harbor. Spotlights swept across the water. A patrol boat's machine gun crew took up position, scanning for any sign of movement. Radio chatter across the base increased sharply as officers debated whether this was a genuine attack or another false alarm triggered by debris and weather. but the geography of the harbor itself worked against the defenders. Sevastopol's port was large, with multiple piers, breakwaters, and moored vessels, creating a maze of obstructions that broke up radar returns and limited sightlines for patrol crews. The drones, having been guided along a route specifically chosen to exploit this complexity, used the clutter of docked ships and harbor infrastructure to mask their final approach. Each time a Russian spotlight or radar operator thought they had a fix on the intrusion, the contact would seem to vanish behind a hull or pier, only to reappear moments later somewhere slightly different, impossible to distinguish with confidence from the dozens of legitimate vessels and floating obstacles cluttering the harbor. By the time Russian commanders fully grasped that they were dealing with a coordinated strike rather than a single stray contact, the drones had already closed to within a few hundred meters of the target pier. The warship sat exactly where Ukrainian intelligence had predicted. Its hull illuminated faintly by dock lighting, crew members visible moving along the deck, apparently unaware of what was approaching from the dark water beyond the breakwater. Chapter 6. The Strike. The lead drone made its final approach at low speed, deliberately avoiding any sudden acceleration that might create a visible wake or draw attention in the final seconds before impact. Its operator, watching through the drone's onboard camera, could now clearly make out the hull of the warship rising ahead, its gray paint catching what little light spilled from the pier. The camera feed showed the waterline, the anchor chain, the exact section of hull the mission planners had identified as the most structurally vulnerable point for a below waterline strike. Aboard the ship, it is likely that at least some crew members eventually spotted movement in the water, a shape too small and too fast to be debris, closing in with unmistakable purpose. Whether anyone had time to raise an alarm, fire a weapon, or attempt any kind of last-second evasive action is difficult to say with certainty. What is clear is that whatever reaction there was, it came too late to change the outcome. The lead drone struck the hull just below the waterline near the engine compartment. The explosion tore through the outer plating and drove a shockwave through the internal structure of the ship, rupturing compartments, severing power and fuel lines, and very likely causing immediate flooding in the affected sections. A column of water and debris erupted upward, briefly illuminated by a flash of orange light before the darkness of the harbor swallowed it again. Seconds later, a second drone reached the ship, striking a slightly different section of the hull toward the stern. This impact deepened the damage already inflicted by the first strike, expanding the breach and further compromising the vessel's structural integrity. Whatever damage control efforts the crew might have attempted in the moments after the first explosion would have been severely hampered by this second impact, particularly if it disrupted power to pumps or emergency systems needed to slow flooding. A third drone, part of the same formation, either failed to reach the target or was intercepted in the chaos following the first two explosions. Naval commanders had planned for exactly this possibility, which is why more than one drone had been committed to the strike in the first place. Even with one drone lost, the damage already inflicted by the two successful hits was more than enough to achieve the mission's objective. Aboard the pier, alarms began sounding across the base. Personnel who had been asleep or on light night duty were roused suddenly by the sound of explosions and the sight of smoke rising from the water near the mooring. Fire crews and damage control teams began scrambling toward the affected vessel, though in the confusion of the moment, it likely took several critical minutes before anyone had a clear picture of what exactly had happened and how severe the damage truly was. Chapter 7. Chaos on the Pier. In the minutes following the strike, Sevastopol's naval base descended into a level of confusion that mirrored many of Ukraine's previous successful drone attacks on the Black Sea Fleet. Communication between different defensive elements broke down under the pressure of the moment. Some patrol boats continued searching for additional drones further out in the harbor, uncertain whether the attack was over or whether more strikes were still incoming. Others raced toward the damaged ship, uncertain what kind of assistance would even be useful given the scale of the flooding already underway. Damage control teams aboard the stricken vessel worked to contain the flooding, but the dual impact points made this significantly more difficult than a single strike would have been. Watertight doors that might have contained flooding from one breach were rendered less effective when a second breach opened elsewhere in the hull, allowing water to spread through connecting compartments faster than pumps could remove it. Crew members were reportedly evacuated from lower decks as the flooding worsened, some suffering injuries from the force of the explosions, or from falls in the darkened, smoke-filled corridors below deck. Meanwhile, base commanders faced an uncomfortable set of questions. How had multiple drones penetrated defenses that had been specifically upgraded following earlier attacks? Why had radar operators failed to raise a serious alarm until the drones were already within the inner harbor? And perhaps most pressingly, was there any indication that additional attacks might follow, targeting other vessels still docked nearby? Search patrols swept the harbor for any sign of a fourth or fifth drone, uncertain whether the attack had involved only the vessels already accounted for or whether more remained hidden somewhere in the clutter of the port. This uncertainty alone caused significant disruption as commanders ordered additional ships moved away from their berths as a precaution, even those with no direct connection to the vessel that had just been struck. In a harbor already congested with docked ships, sudden repositioning under emergency conditions created its own hazards, including at least one reported near collision between two vessels maneuvering in the dark. By early morning, as daylight began to break over Sevastopol, the extent of the damage became fully visible. The warship sat low in the water near its berth, listing slightly, its hull scarred by two distinct breach points below the waterline. Whether the vessel could ultimately be salvaged and repaired, or whether the damage was severe enough to result in a total loss, would depend on assessments that could only be made once the ship had been stabilized and, if possible, moved to drier dock for inspection. What was already clear, even in those first chaotic hours, was that Ukraine had once again demonstrated an ability to penetrate one of Russia's most heavily defended naval bases using a handful of relatively inexpensive drones guided by weeks of patient intelligence gathering rather than brute force alone. Chapter 8. The Cost of Predictability. In the days that followed, Russian Naval Command reportedly ordered a review of docking procedures across the Black Sea Fleet, aiming to reduce the predictability that had made this strike possible in the first place. Ships were instructed to vary their mooring locations more frequently, to avoid extended stays at any single pier, and to increase patrol coverage during the early morning hours when this attack, and several others before it, had taken place. But these adjustments came at a cost. Constantly repositioning vessels required additional fuel, additional crew hours, and additional strain on maintenance schedules already stretched thin by years of war. A fleet that could never settle into a predictable rhythm also struggled to conduct the routine resupply, repair, and rotation operations necessary to keep ships combat ready. In trying to eliminate the predictability that Ukraine had exploited, Russian commanders were forced to accept a different kind of inefficiency, one that slowly eroded the operational tempo of the fleet as a whole. For Ukraine, the successful strike reinforced a strategy that had already proven effective throughout the war. Rather than attempting to match Russia's naval power ship for ship, focus instead on patient intelligence gathering, exploit predictable patterns, and use relatively low-cost drones to inflict damage disproportionate to their price tag. Each successful strike against the Black Sea Fleet chipped away not just at Russia's material naval strength, but at the confidence of sailors and commanders who once considered Sevastopol one of the most secure bases in the entire Russian Navy. The psychological effect of these attacks extended well beyond the single ship damaged in this particular strike. Crews across the fleet became increasingly aware that no berth, however heavily defended, could be considered fully safe. Reports suggested rising anxiety among sailors assigned to vessels docked at Sevastopol, with some crew members reportedly requesting transfers away from ships stationed there. A base that had once symbolized Russian naval dominance over the Black Sea had become, instead, a symbol of vulnerability. Chapter 9. Aftermath and what it revealed. In the weeks following the strike, satellite imagery analysts continued monitoring Sevastopol, looking for signs of the damaged warship's fate. Some images suggested the vessel had eventually been moved to a dry dock facility, indicating an attempt at repair rather than an immediate write-off. Whether repairs would ultimately succeed and how long the vessel would remain out of active service remained uncertain for months afterward, itself a form of ongoing cost to Russian naval capability, regardless of the eventual outcome. For Ukrainian military planners, the operation offered valuable lessons that would inform future strikes. The success of using multiple drones to guarantee at least one or two effective hits, even when facing a heavily defended target, reinforced the value of redundancy over reliance on any single weapon achieving a clean, unopposed strike. The importance of patient, weeks-long intelligence gathering over quick, opportunistic attacks was similarly reinforced, showing that understanding an enemy's routine could be just as valuable as any weapon system in overcoming layered defenses. More broadly, the strike became another data point in a larger pattern that had been reshaping naval warfare throughout the conflict. Traditional naval power, built around large, expensive warships bristling with sensors and weapons, was proving vulnerable to a different kind of threat: cheap, numerous, and patient unmanned systems willing to wait weeks for the right moment and willing to sacrifice multiple units to guarantee a handful of successful hits. Whether this particular corvette ever returned to full service, or whether it joined the growing list of Russian naval losses in the Black Sea, the operation itself had already achieved much of its purpose long before the outcome of repairs was known. It forced Russian commanders to spend resources on constant repositioning, eroded confidence among naval crews stationed at what was once considered an untouchable base, and demonstrated once again that, in this war, the size and firepower of a fleet mattered far less than the ability to protect it from a threat that could approach silently, strike without warning, and disappear back into the darkness of the Black Sea before anyone fully understood what had happened. For analysts studying the broader trajectory of the war, this strike fit into a growing body of evidence suggesting that naval dominance in the 21st century could no longer be measured purely in tonnage, missile counts, or the size of a fleet's flagship vessels. A nation without a traditional navy of its own had, through patience, engineering iteration, and careful intelligence work, managed to impose real costs on one of the largest naval forces in the world. The lesson was not that large warships had become obsolete, but that they had become far more expensive to protect than anyone had assumed at the start of the war. And that expense would only continue to grow as long as operations like this one kept succeeding.